to motor west. Travel my way, take the highway, that's the best. Get your kicks on Route 66. It winds from Chicago to L.A. More than 2,000 miles all the way. Get your kicks on Route 66.
I've spent most of my life traveling around the world trying to uncover the things that make a place unique. Could be a ritual, type of architecture, a way of cooking, a religious ceremony. One of the traditions that makes our country unique is the historical migrations into and around the United States. We are a nation of movers, and we can be divided into two groups: those who moved into our country from another country, and those who moved around our country after they got here. Today, everyone in the United States immigrated here or is the descendant of someone who immigrated here, even if that ancestor came over the Bering Straits 35,000 years ago or was brought here against their will. Our nation has always been concerned with immigration. Who's coming to our country, and how will they affect our way of life? So many people of German origin were moving into the colonies that Benjamin Franklin began to worry if the colonies would end up speaking German instead of English. 250 years have passed, and we are still very much concerned about immigration. If the numbers of movers are large enough, the shifts in population will not only alter the lives of the people who are immigrating, but also the places where they leave and the places where they are settling. Immigration can rebalance economies, reorganize political systems, and transform cultures. The immigration of various groups to the United States has continually reshaped our nation. But just as important is the migration of people within the United States. Finding out who went where and why in the history of our country is not easy. But once you find those patterns, the stories are amazing. This is the first of 3 programs about migration within the United States. It takes a look at who, where, and why people moved during the 1800s, how the government took the lands of the Native Americans and gave them to the settlers, why the government began offering cheap land and mineral rights, the gold rush, and the move from farms to cities. I'm going to start in Phoenix, Arizona, because Phoenix is a good example of the history of migration in America. For over 2,000 years, the Native Americans of the Hohokam tribe lived on this land, which eventually became Phoenix.
They were engaged in a really widespread, pretty formal trade economy. They traded with people in Mexico and in other different areas. They imported a lot of crafts from other Hohokam, and they grew a lot of agricultural products here that we believe that they probably traded to other villages.
They built over 135 miles of irrigation canals that made the desert arable. These same canals were used to build the modern Arizona canal system. Starting in the 1500s, settlers began coming in from Mexico and the Atlantic coast. In 1867, Jack Swilling, a Confederate veteran of the Civil War and an early advocate of open carry, was traveling through the Salt River Valley and noticed that the land was ideal for cultivation. Swilling teamed up with Lord Darrell Dupa. Both men had a deep appreciation of the mustache, and that helped them bond. Swilling was one of the original settlers and suggested the name Phoenix because it described a city born from the ruins of a former civilization. The city was settled in 1867 as an agricultural community focused on cotton, citrus fruits, cattle, and alfalfa. At the end of World War II, air conditioning was introduced, which made it a much more comfortable place to live during the summers. And with that improvement, high-tech industries began to move in. I'm starting in Phoenix because it's a good example of the history of migration in America, but also because I want to work with Stuart Schoen and get him to help me with this material. Stuart has some extraordinary data on population shifts in the United States and considerable interest in how, when, and why people move around our nation.
I think there's no shortage of examples or anecdotes you could tell to describe what mobility means to Americans. The phrase that always comes up to me is the phrase, hey, it's a free country. And I think that as it relates to moving, nobody in this country thinks that there's a city within our borders that they couldn't move to without just simply having the notion to do so.
And he has a good reason for his interest in people moving around our country. His grandfather invented the U-Haul trailer, which in itself is an insight to how people migrate around the U.S. And his father, Joe, is the son of the founder and CEO.
In 1945, when the war in Europe was winding down, but before the war in Japan was over, my father, who was in the Navy in Corona, California, got an early discharge. They were then letting people go home. He had a wife, an infant, and they had a little trailer they lived in near the Navy base. They wanted to go back home to Washington State, and of course the few things they had was more than they could put in the car, so they looked for a way to bring it with them, and they wanted to rent a trailer. You could rent a trailer in Southern California, but you could not take it anyplace. You had to bring it right back from where you rented it. So they reflected on that the whole way back on the drive and said there's a better way. And that's how U-Haul started.
I know your family thinks they invented the U-Haul business, and in 1945 they did as it is now. But I figured that there were times in history where people wanted to use something to move and they didn't want to own it. So I asked a researcher to look it up and look at the kind of things that we found. That's Hannibal crossing the Alps.
I see that.
And you see, he didn't need these elephants after he beat Rome. And if you get in real close, you can see he rented them.
I never knew that.
And those guys that came across the country going west, you have a wagon train. So you get in close and you see, apparently they rented them. And we found a shot of Columbus's boats. And you get in there close on the Nina, and you see rented. I thought you needed to know this.
This is good. This is good medicine for me.
All right, enough fooling around. Let's get to the real information. The place to start is the big relocations of the 1800s. People were searching for wealth, and the federal government provided the essential tools. Some of the migration took place among people looking for a better life. And some were forced immigrations, totally opposed by the people who were being moved around.
The lands of the Native Americans were essentially snatched up and offered to white settlers as cheap acreage, pretty much. The government was also busy giving away what became valuable mineral rights. And then there was the discovery of gold in California.
With the exception of the first Thanksgiving and the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe, there are not many stories in which white Americans have a good relationship with Native Americans.
Most of the time, the white settlers feared the Native Americans. And that's unfortunate, obviously. And I think that the reason was because they wanted that land, they wanted to occupy that land, and even though the Native Americans had been living there for centuries, that was a little irrelevant to the settlers at the time.
George Washington thought the problem could be solved by civilizing the Native Americans. Teach them to speak English, convert them to Christianity, introduce them to capitalism, show them how to use the television remote. So President Washington wanted the Native Americans to give up their civilization and live like the colonists, which was an extraordinarily dumb idea because the Native Americans had had their culture for thousands of years, and in most cases it was better than what the colonists had.
A number of Indian nations lived in the part of the country that is now the southeastern part of the United States. And of course, they wanted to keep their land, they wanted to keep their culture. It was excellent for their way of life, for farmland, and unfortunately, it was also really great for farming cotton.
During the early 1800s, as more and more white settlers moved into these areas, they became more and more determined to get their hands on the land that belonged to the southern tribes. Actually, that's not completely correct. They were interested in owning the land, but the only hands that were going to get on or into that land were the hands of their slaves. The native nations didn't vote. But the settlers did. So clearly it was the responsibility of the state governments to help the settlers get the land on which the Indians lived. The states began passing laws that limited the rights of the Native Americans so the settlers could start taking over their land.
Instead of going to war, in 1831, the Cherokee Nation actually sued the state of Georgia, and it went to the Supreme Court. And in the case, the court actually favored with the Cherokee. And what they ruled was that the laws of Georgia or any of the other states could hold no force over a sovereign nation, which was the Cherokee Nation.
At the time, Andrew Jackson was the president of the United States. But before he was president, he was a general in the U.S. Army, and his specialty was organizing brutal campaigns against the Creeks in Georgia and the Seminoles in Florida. And at the end of each of his campaigns, hundreds of thousands of acres were transferred from the Indian nations to the settlers.
In 1830, Jackson kind of helped move things along, as it were, with the Indian Removal Act. And what that did was took native lands that were east of the Mississippi, where cotton grew so well, and forced a swap and put those folks west of the Mississippi in the area that's now Oklahoma.
So what about the Supreme Court decision? Well, Jackson said it was the Supreme Court's decision. Let them try and enforce it.
The first nation to be forced off their land was the Choctaw. And in the winter of 1831, the U.S. Army showed up and forced a march west of the Mississippi. And this happened with no supplies, no food, and even put some of the folks in chains. Around 2,000 Choctaw died in this journey. Then the federal government forced the Creeks off their land. Of the 15,000 Indians who were driven out, 3,500 died.
But let's not single out Jackson for his total lack of moral standing and honesty. He was not the only representative of the dark side. And the winner of the Darth Vader Award is, the envelope, please. Thank you. Oh, look at this. It's General Winfield Scott. In 1838, President Martin Van Buren directed Scott to take 7,000 of his soldiers, round up all the Cherokee, and move them west to what they called the Indian Territory. Scott rounded up the Indians and held them in stockades while the settlers looted their homes. Then he marched them for more than 1,000 miles. 4,000 Cherokee died on the trip, and it became known as the Trail of Tears.
And these forced migrations were not limited to just the southern states. In 1832, the Black Hawk Wars in Illinois and Wisconsin ended up taking millions of acres from Native Americans.
My understanding was the federal government assured the Native Americans that the land they were getting west of the Mississippi would remain theirs forever. But forever began to get shorter and shorter, and when Oklahoma became a state, forever was over. This is the Heard Museum. It's one of the best places in the world to learn about the history, culture, and the arts of the American Indian.
Heard Museum is a great place to visit if you want to get a good, in-depth overall sense of American Indian people of the Southwest especially. One of the things that American Indians say when we ask, what would you like us to tell our visitors to make sure they know, they say, tell them we are still here.
New regions were opening in the West as Americans and new arrivals from Europe sought fresh opportunities in virgin lands.
Starting in the middle of the 1800s, millions of people in the eastern part of the United States began heading to the western part. Farmers headed to the agricultural lands on the Pacific coast. During the 1880s, over 2.5 million acres of western wilderness became farmland.
When you look at the migration pattern pretty closely, it's quite interesting. It's all based on latitude. So you moved west, but you came along the same line of latitude as you were on the east. In 1850, most of the people who lived outside the state where they were born settled in a new area that was similar in latitude to the state they were born in. How weird is that? Well, actually, not very weird at all. Most of the folks that were moving in the 1800s were farmers, and farm seeds and farm animals tend to really do better in certain latitudes. Northern farmers worked with horses, and horses liked the cooler weather. So those farmers moved up to the northwestern states. Southern farmers liked mules, and mules preferred warmer areas like Texas and New Mexico. The farm families who settled at familiar latitudes had a greater degree of success, and that encouraged other families to join them.
So then the United States government decides it's going to help. And as we all know, when the government decides to help you, it's not necessarily help, and there's always a catch. So in 1862, they passed the Homestead Act. People going west can get free land, but getting west costs a lot of money, and starting the farm costs a lot of money. So in the end, the people that went west for the Homestead Act were actually well-to-do farmers to begin with.
At about the same time the farmers were heading to the farm, the miners were heading to Sacramento. Actually, I think the proper term is rushing. And a little bit later, they continued their rushing to the mountains of Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, and other western states. Most of the places that the miners were rushing to were pretty sparsely populated, and so they were classified as territories. However, after all this migration happened, these areas had enough population that they could now qualify for statehood. Most of the folks heading west were white, native-born Americans, but there were large numbers of people who had immigrated to the United States from Northern Europe. In states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Colorado, Montana, and even Wyoming, families where the head of the household had immigrated to the U.S. represented almost a third of the population. In addition, there were Mexicans coming up from Mexico and Chinese coming from Asia and Australia.
Starting in 1848, about 300,000 people rushed to California to find gold. Most of them dreamed of getting rich and going home. About 50,000 went to Oregon to start farms, and about 40,000 went to Utah. The initial migrants to Utah were Mormons who wanted to establish a permanent settlement where they would be safe from religious persecution, and they could build a better future.
That's true, but finding gold or getting some farmland wasn't the only reason for moving. A lot of people moved for health. The Ohio and Mississippi valleys were breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that spread malaria. The West Coast was constantly being promoted as a healthful environment. Another reason that made the West Coast look attractive were the mild winters. If you could keep your livestock outdoors throughout the year and avoid the cost of building shelters and feeding your animals, you saved a considerable amount of money, time, and effort. And the arrival of the railroads made migration to the West easier, faster, and safer.
The discovery of gold in California changed the history of California, but it also changed the destiny of the United States. By today's standards, about 50 billion, that's billion with a B, worth of gold was taken out of California, and it supplied much of the funds necessary for the federal government to conduct the Civil War. The gold also became a major reason to build a transcontinental railroad, which united the east and the western parts of the nation and opened the West to settlement and commercial development. The federal government was so eager to get California into the Union that it was the only state in the nation that never went through a period as a territory. It grew so fast and was so important that Washington told it to just come on in. Such is the power of gold. In the 1840s, California was sparsely populated, with a native Indian population of about 14,000. The land had just been taken over by the United States as part of the settlement of the Mexican-American War. A few hundred settlers from the east dragged their wagons in each year, and that was pretty much it. But the discovery of gold changed everything. Within 3 years, the population exploded from 14,000 to 225,000. People came from all over the world in search of gold. The great fortunes that were made during the gold rush were not made by the miners who separated the rocks from the gold, but by the guys who separated the gold from the miners. The cost of living in the gold country took almost everything the miners made and made the suppliers rich. Eggs were selling for $50 a dozen, and they weren't even organic. 4 of the richest guys in town were Charles Crocker, a dry goods merchant, Leland Stanford, a grocer, and 2 hardware dealers, C.P. Huntington and Mark Hopkins. They were known as the Big Four, and the fortunes they made selling things to the miners gave them a one-track mind. And that track became known as the Central Pacific Railroad, which was financed by the Big Four. The first spike was set at the edge of Sacramento's waterfront in 1863. More track was laid as fast as possible. California's gold was running out, but silver had been discovered in Nevada, and the Big Four loved the idea of controlling the commerce between the mines and the coasts. Federal money poured into the railroad because that would keep California and its wealth in the Union during the war between the states. The Old West was a tough place to live, and in some places it still is.
Them there's the fellas we's looking for.
I'm gonna put you in a coffin.
I've been looking to kill you.
You woolly maggots!
Ain't no woolly maggot. Pull your pistols.
Hey, what's going on here?
What in tarnation that feller doing here?
This is a public broadcasting program about internal migration in the United States.
Who is this guy?
Let's make that greenhorn dance.
Dance, what a great idea. Everybody dance.
Well, yeah.
Okay, that's part 1. Trail of Tears.
Heading west and the gold rush.
Please join us next time when we look at the move from farm to city, the Dust Bowl migrations, how people got relocated during the Second World War, and the great migration of African Americans out of the South. For Travels and Traditions, I'm Burt Wolfe. But wait, there's more. Whenever we edit one of our programs, we always end up with more good material than we can fit in. Interviews, stories, recipes. So we decided to put them on our website, burtwolfe.com.